Okay, good afternoon. We're going to get started on our panel called Displacement in New York City, Making Space for Our Neighbors. I'm Sheila Foster at Georgetown University, and my panelists will introduce themselves, but very briefly, Ana Baptista, Amy Chester, and Marco Tedesco. And I'm going to start out by kind of situating some of the things that you're going to hear on this panel in the context of the New York City panel on climate change, which kind of mirrors IPCC at the international level, and in that its responsibility is to collect the best science and give input and feedback to the city on climate adaptation and climate change projections. And I have been, I'm trying to figure out how to make this go for, I have been co-chairing the work group on equity. Can someone help me figure out how to advance the slides? Yeah, I tried that. There we go.
Yep, sometimes you
Perfect.
just
Okay,
gotta.
thank you. Thank you for that. Okay. Back to the introduction. So I've been co-chairing the work group on equity with Ana Baptista, and that work group has been operating for about 6 years. And I want to start with our last report, which spanned 2016 to 2019, and in which we offered a framework for climate equity for New York City. That had 3 components: distributive equity, contextual equity, and procedural equity, drawn largely from literature on both environmental justice and climate justice. Partly what the city wanted us to do was to give a tool for tracking social vulnerability in New York City, and also tracking it over time. And one of the things that our work group found was that although there are well-utilized indices like the social vulnerability, the SOVI and the SVI, that do track vulnerability over time, not all of the factors that or indicators in them applied appropriately to New York City, and particularly when you look at the neighborhood level. And we pulled out, as a result, a number of factors, which are on the left, which we suggested the city use to track social vulnerability over time. We also noted some of the disadvantages of just relying on indices for understanding climate inequity or climate injustice. For example, SOVI can tell us very well, I think what a lot of us already know, that the city is not just highly segregated by race and class, and that those neighborhoods that are most segregated have higher exposure to heat, less access to resources, et cetera, et cetera. But what it doesn't tell us is why, right, that social vulnerability is being produced, and how certain neighborhoods, how we can help those neighborhoods avoid social vulnerability. And so what we have moved to in this current iteration of the equity work group for the New York City panel on climate change is to looking at a broader framework for climate justice for the city. And this is rooted in large part in a developing social science literature, a lot of which you've heard here over the last few days, that really makes it clear, right, the ways that past policies and practices, from redlining and housing decisions and other kinds of historically discriminatory policies, have shaped current climate risk, current land use patterns, and how those current land use patterns and climate risks then are shaping future mobility and displacement. And so that's where we come today, is that the work of our equity work group is not just looking contextually at how this happens in New York, but also trying to propose a metric, which you'll hear about in a second, to capture the intersection of risk, social vulnerability, and displacement based on, I think, this more robust or thicker notion of climate injustice and inequity. So right now I'm going to pass it to my co-chair, Ana Baptista, who's going to say a little bit more about a case study that we've looked at on Managed Retreat.
Thanks, Sheila. Sure, no problem.
Just fixing a tech issue. What's that? Ah, okay.
They were changing here, but not online.
Not online. I see.
Sorry.
No problem.
This is a session where you have to meditate for a few minutes after what you heard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that on? Are they seeing it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, everyone. I just was going to mention one case study that we are including in NPCC 4 in our equity chapter, in addition to looking at indices that examine these different intersecting vulnerabilities. We also wanted to look around and see, are there any cases or studies of how you do equitable climate adaptation and resiliency. And we have several case studies from around the world and New York City area, but the city of New York in particular was interested in us taking a close examination of Edgemere, where they have done a lot of work and investment since Hurricane Sandy, before Hurricane Sandy even. And they really felt strongly that this was an important case to include. And so we wanted to look at it as a best practice in many ways. And, obviously in looking at Edgemere, it's not, completely, unified the result of best practice. I think there's a lot of opportunities and challenges that are evident in the Edgemere case. And what's interesting is that it reflects many of the things Sheila talked about, right? This long historical pattern of land use and zoning that relate back to issues around racial segregation, redlining practices, slum clearance. There's a whole series of, many decades of disinvestment that impacted this community. And, it shows today in the way that Edgemere was vulnerable in many ways. So we see this longer history before Superstorm Sandy. What's interesting about Edgemere is that it underwent an urban renewal plan, right, in the 1990s that basically turned over the several lots, over 100 lots, into city acquisition. And the city had planned, 600 units of affordable housing that was supposed to happen over several years. And then within a decade, they had the economic recession of 2008. And instead of 300 units of affordable housing, there were much less built. So it sort of got hit first with the economic recession and then with Superstorm Sandy. So that realization of the urban renewal plan and affordable housing with all these city-owned lots never really materialized. And then after Sandy, this majority Black and Latinx community faced a lot of challenges, and the city embarked on this Resilient Edgemere community plan. One of the things that the city really emphasized was this was a community-driven process. There was a lot of effort that went into the planning with multiple organizations, and they put into it several important elements, including this innovation in community land trust, right? Trying this approach of community land trust as a way to help with the process of the voluntary buyouts in areas where they were introducing the hazard mitigation zone, right? Where they were trying to move people away from the most dangerous, most climate risk areas. Of course, this process of the voluntary buyout was met with lots of challenges, a lot of complexity. A lot of residents were not necessarily really interested in the buyouts and had a lot of concerns about the whole process. So even though there were some innovative approaches there were also many challenges in terms of actually realizing the buyout process. And so, their NPCC 4, I think this equity chapter really speaks to the complexity. It's not just about where people are vulnerable to multiple risks and the intersection of the housing, affordable housing risks, the lack of affordable housing. It's this trying to deal with the sedimentation of land uses over time and racial disparities that are embedded in our land uses is a very complicated process. And even in Edgemere, which the city considers its best case scenario, where there were hundreds of properties in city ownership, there was still not enough funding and opportunity to move people out of harm's way. So it's extremely difficult to do this, but the CLT is moving forward. They've selected a nonprofit to do the CLT, so that's moving ahead. And there are continued community-driven zoning. So the rezoning of Edgemere was approved also last year with a lot of community input, and the community really wanted less density than was originally proposed. They wanted a lot more affordable housing. And so they got some wins in the rezoning due to a lot of community-based organizing and effort in that process. But, you know, for NPCC4 purposes, we still have a lot of questions about the replicability of this model and even using CLT if you are in a city that has tremendous market pressures for housing and you don't have a lot of available land or city-owned land to be able to put that together in terms of buyouts. So there's still a lot of questions about how to do it effectively. So yeah, I think I'm going to pass it over to my colleague. Yeah, Marco.
So this is, I'm gonna just show you something I showed yesterday, so I'll be brief. The excuse here is to, by the way, I'm Marco, I work at Columbia. I'm a member of a New York City Independent Climate Change Equity Working Group, and I've been developing the CDSV, Climate Displacement Social Vulnerability Index on New York City, which combines social vulnerability, climate hazards, and displacement. The excuse here is really to walk you through a little bit of the index, and then Amy she's going to talk a lot more about the project they're going to do on flood and other risks, and then we open up for interaction and conversations, hopefully. We again combine these, you know, the index combines these three aspects. This is a much shorter version of the presentation I gave, but in reality, practically speaking, what you see is the climate displacement data produced by the New York City Mayor's Office. Then we combine with the Social Vulnerability Index SVI and the hazards from the FEMA Natural Risk Index. Everything is done at census tract level. One aspect, I'm bypassing all the details. I'm happy to share a draft of a paper we submitted to the Environmental Research Letter Journal about this. But we look at 5 different hazards. So my intention and our goal is really to start looking at a compounding effect, not only between climate displacement and social vulnerability, but also within the climate among the different hazards. And then we look at map, we did some geographic analysis, but also we merged it with some health data to start understanding what in the future is going to be, of course, very soon, well, unfortunately, the combination of the potential impacts of only climate displacement, but also health issues. So very quickly, before we go ahead, and you can find these on, uploaded, the same presentation I had yesterday. These are the maps. There is also Puma tracks overlying, and apologize for some style missing because I transferred presentations here and there, so some typos and fonts are out of order. Different maps for different hazards. The only difference here between these 5 different maps is that you have 5 different hazards: coastal flooding, riverine flooding, hurricanes, winter weather, and heat waves. The maps are available as a GIS. I built something on ArcGIS so that you can also explore it. I still not matured enough to launch it, but if you want to play with that, feel free to reach out. Data is publicly available, free. I can share it with you right away. There's no problem with that. What do we want to do? Of course, some of the things that we think could be helpful with, we can, of course, play with which of the 3 elements is playing a role in each census tract when it comes to the index composite, right? So you can say which aspect is socioeconomic, the displacement, the heat waves, in this case, component, where is playing a larger role to create this index, and maybe you can start thinking about attribution in the future. We also can look at where multiple climate hazards are compounding. So these are the tracks where the index was ranking on the top 10 values for New York, and there are some tracks, they have 3 or 4 of these hazards, basically. And this means that in one specific tract, you have more than one hazard that is giving you the highest score risk, basically. You can then look at how things change. In this case, for example, very quickly, you can see the changes in socioeconomic and demographics from the 2000s. But interesting aspect, I picked up this example for today because you can see in this southern part of Brooklyn, where, of course, the highest risk is where the red is in this case. Interestingly, in this area, there is a huge increase of Asians, which is a topic and a subject that's not been really discussed a lot in New York City, but I think given the data there I'm seeing and we're looking at, is becoming, and it will become more and more important, of course. And then, of course, Latinx and Hispanics and Blacks are also increasing, but the white people are basically moving out very, very consistently with what we see in other areas. The other thing that we could do, just to wrap up, is looking at the health. I basically took at the people with asthma between 18 and 65, and same with diabetes. And you can I grouped the CDSV values in tens, just to make the graph a little bit clearer. And what you see here is the box plot, which tells you how on the y-axis, the number of people with asthma or diabetes, and the x-axis is the score that we calculated. What you basically see here is that as the risk basically of multiple things combined increases, because that's how you can see the index values, then the number of people with asthma and diabetes increases. What does it mean? It means that areas where you already have people with high problems related to asthma and diabetes are also the areas where the compounding effects of these factors is going to be the hardest. And so in this case, these tools, qualitative tools, hopefully they will help to maybe materialize some action at policy level or provide some more information to empower the communities to bring forward their actions and their calls. But in the meantime, again, this is in the paper. I'm going to give the mic to Amy, who's going to Rebuild by Design. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm the director of Rebuild by Design, and we are a nonprofit that's located in New York City that started after Hurricane Sandy, originally as an initiative of Hurricane Sandy, of the President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Task Force. And we now work with communities locally, nationally, internationally to think about large-scale infrastructure changes to address climate change. And we do a lot of research, particularly when we feel like there is not a conversation that should be happening. And this is kind of the origin of this report that we did with Milliman that we put out a couple of months ago, about December, that was talking about climate displacement in New York City and the idea of making space for our neighbors. I started my career as a tenant organizer. If anyone knows what it's like to look for an apartment in New York City or to feel like your apartment is in a situation that is not stable, it takes over your entire life. And we really feel and felt that if we get ahead of this problem, we can start making space for our neighbors in ways that actually enhance every community, and to do it in ways that people would accept instead of push away from. But we can only do that if we have the data and we start talking about it. So that is why we created this data. We don't think that this is going to be exactly what's going to happen, because we know that the city is creating interventions all along the shoreline, but it is really created as a precautionary tale of this is what could happen if we don't start putting all of our mechanisms and policies into place. So are we, this right one? Is that it? Or this? Okay, got it. And what's really exciting at this moment is that the stars have finally aligned after 10 years. We have, on the state level, New York State voters passed a $4.2 billion environmental bond act that came directly out of research that Rebuild by Design did in 2019, and a very concerted effort of convincing Governor Cuomo to introduce it. And many organizations got it passed through the legislature and through the voters. And what's particularly exciting about that is that as a $250 million set aside for a state managed retreat program. So we have that money, it's there. We're forcing the government now to set up a program. And then the city recently announced a $3.5 billion investment into green infrastructure and land acquisitions to address heavy rain. So this is the opportunity to start thinking about where are we going to put everybody. And this is the flood map of New York City. At a basic sense, about 50% of our city is at risk. And we also put out a report, I don't have it in here, a couple of years ago, after our city put out a report that quantified all the things that are in the floodplain. We put out a report of the people that were in the floodplain. And what our report found is that there's 1.3 million people living in the floodplain or directly adjacent, meaning like only half their block group was in the floodplain. And that number could increase to over 2 million by 2100. And that the demographics today are that more than 50% of those people are people of color, and more than 50% of those people are considered low income by HUD standards. So this is what it looks like, the median income, and how it's going to evolve over time. That's 14% of the residents that are living in the floodplain today. So we embarked on this report with our partner Milliman to better understand how future storm surge flooding, driven in part by sea level rise, could impact New York City neighborhoods. We did not have the rain data at the same time, so this is just a coastal study. We wanted to understand the context of both the physical threats and the social and financial threats caused by people who are moving. So understanding that there will be some migration, better understand the socioeconomic makeup of who's living in the floodplain in terms of like the rent that they're paying, and add to an unbelievable growing body of research to help provide some solutions. So we took a couple of different data points. We looked at the NPCC 3, future floodplain, the census block routes, the American Community Survey data, and segregated New York City into 4 quadrants to understand where will it flood, what neighbors will be affected, who lives in the floodplain, and then where are people likely going to go. So this is just taking a look, and I'm going to just take you step by step through the data, taking a look at the block grants that would be the block groups that would be impacted by the floodplain in 2050. These are the lowest income block groups in New York City. And what we did is we divided the city into 4 quadrants according to who lives there and how much they're already paying for rent and how much they are, what is their income. And we have 4 different quadrants. The first being a majority of the city, which is stable, which is considered higher income in the scale of income, but have a very low risk of flooding. So they likely won't be moving. Then you have the immigrating neighborhoods, which is kind of on the other side of the higher income folks who have a high risk of flooding and a high income, and they will likely be able to move first and before a government program because they can leave whenever they want. Then we have crisis neighborhoods who are low income and have high flooding risk who would not be able to leave without government intervention of both helping them figure out how to leave and have the dollars, but also figuring out where to go. And then destinations are the places where both immigrating and crisis communities might look to move first according to a similar cost for rents. So we assigned block groups to the 4 displacement quadrants based on that data. And as I said before, the immigrating population is mostly white, single family homeowners like Seagate and Manhattan Beach. The destination populations tend to be the areas where people are likely going to move due to the average rent, and they are majority non-white residents that already live in rented and multifamily dwellings. So this is the areas that are most at risk. The current median rental prices are at least $500 a month lower than the emigrating areas. The crisis population, which is a majority of non-white people, Coney Island, Rockaway Park, Seaside, East Harlem, that will absolutely need help. And their current median rents are some of the lowest throughout the city. And then the stable population, which tends to be those on higher ground, like Brooklyn Heights and Jackson Heights, and they will be less impacted. And what we were able to show is that over 50% of New Yorkers are at risk of displacement without a comprehensive and proactive government planning process and program. And that is both primary displacement and secondary displacement. So it's the people who are likely white that are going to move first, and then displace the people who are in the locations where they already live into further inland. And 1/3 of the households and destinations area live below the poverty level and are at the highest risk for displacement. So those are the people that are going to feel that burden first and have practically no other choices in a city like New York City. And we created this so governments can start using it as a planning tool. There's a number of recommendations I won't go into now, but would love to discuss them with you in our conversation. I just want to say a couple of things about next steps. And I think the first one is probably the most important. And we are actively testing and really believe in it, of creating the framing of retreat to be an anti-displacement strategy. That if we plan ahead and if everyone is at the table, then neighbors will have choices that are nearby and they won't have to leave either their community or maybe a nearby community or the city. And that doesn't mean that they have to stay nearby, but they should have the option to stay nearby. So if we get ahead of it, this could actually be something that we want to work with housing advocates to create as a displacement strategy. We're also working in 2 communities right now, or 2 projects right now, one in Northern Queens to understand what communities would want to see in a buyout program. The other project is with New York City. The actual city is working with us to, we're going to be kicking off some working groups soon. We really want to understand from the residents' perspective before the city starts making policy of what would they need in order to feel secure to even come to the table and have these conversations so they wouldn't feel as threatened. And then, as I mentioned before, we're going to convene working groups to address a number of things, including one specifically on climate migration that's going to be led by New York City Mayor's Office and New York City DEP. And hopefully that will feed right into their $3.5 billion pot that they can then use more wisely. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to open it up for questions, comments, criticisms, anything, reactions. Yes.
I think we need a mic for the people online. Okay, you got it. I think we have helpers that
Yeah.
are here.
Thank you all for the information. I was curious about the ways in which those next steps and the vision for the New York panel on climate change sort of aligns with or breaks from what housing justice advocates are pushing for, because I feel like in a lot of these conversations about managed retreat, they're a little decontextualized from the kind of enduring chronic affordability and housing crisis. And so, but we're not starting from scratch, you know, like people have been working on this stuff. And so, yeah, just any comments on overlap or what we can learn from social movements for justice.
So, yes.
I'm Nathan Jesse. I'm a postdoc environmental fellow at Princeton's High Meadows Environmental Institute.
Great, wonderful. So I think that's a great question. I mean, one of the things we did on the panel, the first time we looked at equity was we worked with 3 community-based organizations around New York, WEAC, Uprose, and The Point in the Bronx, because what our message to the city was that we have to see all these issues in context, right? And part of the context is not just kind of the history of racism and how all that stuff's baked in, but also the affordability crisis. And now we know, right, in part from, I think, Amy's work and others, that if you just kind of put a buyout or managed retreat program on top of all of what's already baked in and what's occurring now, the results will be predictable. So I think we're both trying to kind of recommend alternative ways to proceed that are not just reparative, right, but also that prevent what is clearly predictable outcomes if we don't do things differently. So that's exactly right. And I think the point of looking at Edgemere is that CLTs is one kind of way forward that addresses both the affordability crisis and managed retreat.
I'll just jump in. I think so much has changed over the past 10 years. There hasn't been, like a moment, but there's been a lot of changes. And this challenge started out, as a Hurricane Sandy issue, and only in 2 communities that I think one asked for it and didn't get it, and one actually got it. So the Oakwood Beach example, it's been used many, many times. And that's the only place where New York City was even going to think about retreat. And retreat was something that I would say up until probably 2 years ago, elected officials wouldn't even say the words. When the Oakwood Beach example is really interesting because the governor forced the community to organize themselves and to make sure, I think it was like 90% of their community, like signed something that they were interested before they'd even have a meeting, because it was such a high button political issue that people weren't ready to have. But as more and more storms have come and people are experiencing climate change in many, many different ways, we put out a report recently called Atlas of Disaster, which was able to show that 90% of US counties had a recent climate event, 90% of US counties. So if you think about that, we're now all in it together. 90% of people are not of people, sorry, but 90% of counties that do not represent 90% of people are experiencing this and now waking up for it and trying to figure their way out. And it's becoming a lot easier to start thinking about it. So we also went from it being a very environmental problem of oh, that's because of carbon in the atmosphere, that's because of 2 degrees and we need to take all the carbon out, to a very practical problem of what are we doing about our supply chain, our food, our housing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think as we come to these understandings, we're bringing more and more people into understanding it. So recently I reached out to housing advocates and I said, hey, we need to have a meeting about this, because I don't think you guys know what's going on, in the background with all of these climate issues, because you're being forced to deal with so many crises in New York City. Yes, the affordability crisis, but also the homeless crisis and suspending laws that, we used to have that in New York City, that people have their right to shelter, and all of a sudden that's changing. And then we have a huge migration crisis and where are people going to live? So there are these 2 scales, like time scales, right? There's the immediate, which a lot of advocates are in different communities and organizing for the immediate. And then there's this slower moving crisis that is beginning to meet right now. And I think we're going to see a lot of what's to come when these 2 groups of people come together. I think, can you come up to the front, because there's some people that are zooming in so they can hear you.
It's for young.
My name is Andrew Fuse. I work with Church World Service, an international humanitarian organization. I live in the Bronx, I think in one of the areas that's in the floodplain, at least, if not now, 50 years from now. So thanks very much for this presentation. I'm curious along those lines, Amy, that you were saying, whether there's also been outreach beyond the mayor's office that you're working with, but more broadly within the departments in the city, within the sort of the civil service, city council offices, to start getting this into people's radar screens and building up the fluency of particularly civil service officers who are going to be planning also education, transportation, food.
The answer is yes. I think almost all of those agencies that you mentioned started having a sustainability officer. Black when Plan YC was created, I was part of the team that created Plan YC. That was 2006, I think. And then after Hurricane Sandy, they started having a real good understanding of how their agency was going to be able to need to be at the table for climate change. So there are many, many, many agencies. We recently held a rainproof symposium where 16 agencies came, which, I feel like it blew my mind, even as a record of somebody that lived in New York City for a long time. And in that, that's the inside of government, but outside of government, there are many, many, many organizations that are working on this. And a lot of them are networked together. There's the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. There's the Waterfront Alliance, there's Rise to Resilience Coalition. There's a growing number of organizations that are coming together around the HAT study, which is the Army Corps of Engineers study that's happening right now, very, very, very actively in it. So there is absolutely room for you to join if you haven't heard of these places, and we can plug you in.
Anna, did you want to say something?
And I think for NPCC 4, we have been working, I mean, I don't know in NPCC 3 how many agencies were involved, but we've been working a lot with the housing and planning HPD office. So in the past, maybe it would have been more the mayor's office of climate and in EJ, but now more and more who's reviewing our work, who's inputting on it, it really is the housing and planning and land use folks. So that's been really useful to have those people in the room and saying, a lot of this is not new. A lot of the groups that we work with on the ground, grassroots groups, they're working as housing organizers, environmental justice organizers, are doing all that work intersectionally. And climate displacement is just another form of like the green gentrification that's been happening for decades. So a lot of this, what's old is new. A lot of these issues very intersectional, very intertwined, and the people on the ground have been living it as not different crises, but intertwined crises. I think the thing is, can our city agencies and our governance structures keep up with the intersectionality of these problems and we need as professionals to get more of those people into conversation with each other and sharing the advocacy and work that they've been doing for decades to see how we can better align it and do it faster and better, and definitely with more community driven. I wouldn't say, we've been very intentional about saying community driven in our work, because there's a lot of community planning and community engagement, but even in Edgemere case studies, we see that we try to feature where it's the communities that are doing their own not only planning processes but development processes. They're actually going, groups are going after different RFIs to become a CLT or to do certain affordable housing projects. They are, also in the driver's seat around the solutions. So that's really important that we're pointing out in NPCC 4.
I also want to add that it's not all good. There's plenty of things that are coming out of the city that are not good. I'll just give one example that a couple of years ago, the city rezoned I think it was 6 or 8 neighborhoods that were the most at risk. These are really the lowest lying areas. And what they did is they are allowed development to happen so long as it was above the floodplain, and then they raised the height limit allowance. So what they essentially did was allowing taller buildings to come in places like Rockaway that do not have the infrastructure and the emergency service capability to have people be rescued if there's ever a problem. So because the city is the city and thinks about things in very siloed ways, even if they're working together, they're looking at zoning as a zoning issue, but not looking at all the other challenges of like, okay, if you want to put people there and you're not going to have them live on the first floor, that's nice. But now you're incentivizing people to go and live in this place. How are they going to get out? My family lives in Rockaway. I have family all over New York City that was affected by Hurricane Sandy. And when the bridges were closed, the bridges are closed. You were stuck there. Like my uncle is stuck there. He decided to stay behind. We couldn't communicate with him. As soon as the bridge opened, I drove my aunt there to go and find my uncle. And I think there's a reality that a lot of people are going to be stuck there. And the other thing that you don't want to find is like islands of protection where the new building, has the protection, but everything else around it doesn't. So you're telling people that it's okay, you're giving them that kind of nod, it's okay to live here, but only certain people are actually going to be able to survive a horrible event.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa. I'm a PhD candidate in environmental policy at Princeton. So I find it notable that both the city and the state are designing these new buyout and acquisition programs. They're both doing it, but separately. So it's potentially good that these are in design, but there's also a history of the previous buyout programs after Sandy being designed separately by the state and the city and coming into conflict with each other. So I'm wondering, from the perspective of like the communities you work with and represent and the NPCC, is this going down a different path than it did 10 years ago? Or are you seeing like a similar pattern here between these two levels of government?
It's the same exact pattern. They're doing it completely separately. I've been trying to get them together and started inviting them to the same meeting. And it actually gets even worse than what you state, because depending on whether or not FEMA dollars are used or HUD dollars are used for buyouts, then there's also different requirements. So it's extraordinarily confusing. And we really need, like, as a society, like a black and a white, to know, what is and what isn't. So it's not going to be, otherwise it gets pushed on the resident to try and figure it out. And there's no way that they will be able to figure that out, no matter who they are.
Hi, my name is Zara Cruz. I'm an architect and teach at the undergrad at Pratt Institute School of Architecture and coordinate also a RAMP initiative, Recover, Adapt, Mitigate and Plan. This was a Sandy response, and I have been working with communities interdisciplinary, and I'm intimidated by the complexity of the challenges where we are facing. And I understand that the conference's title is Managed Retreats, but I almost want to see it in a timeline. Because before we start the managed retreat, we have to address also the needs of the renters. They can't opt for buyout. They don't have money to move. They're actually stuck. Edgemere is a good example. I've worked with RISE numerous times, and I know the area like the palm of my hand. 110 vacant lots. What is it in juxtaposed to the old hospital site that is now built? 2,100 units. Urban East is bringing 1,700 units. The Edgemere population is doubled by these two development. Let's not to mention the other developments in Far Rockaway and over here and over there. And we are talking only about the population that is most underserved, most vulnerable. Well, you have to get out, but the others can come in. So the messaging, we are not giving them time to economic development so that they can have money to have options. Hats project you're mentioning for 10 years. I have attended so many community meetings, and there were elderly women, and they said, I've been coming to these meetings for 30 years and nothing has changed. So I don't know where to, as I said originally, I'm so intimidated by the complexity of the projects or challenge. And I don't know when to put my right foot in front of my left foot and make a forward motion, because managed retreat is not an answer. I was happy to see the other side of the perspective, the receiving communities. Which receiving community? Where? Do they have enough hospitals? Do they have enough schools? Do they have enough infrastructure?
You're absolutely right. And they don't have any of those things. And to be honest, if you don't have a mechanism that is going to get them those things right now, even like a large development that would have an EIS. I mean, I've been through so many EISs, and the communities get so frustrated because even if they find something in the EIS that they have to address, they just kind of check it off and be like, it's addressed. And
I almost need a flow chart and we can say, okay, we need 10 years for this and 20 years for that, and maybe we can do something next in isolation. At the end of the fourth day, I'm more frustrated than I.
Yeah, I think you're, I empathize with the feeling of being overwhelmed with the complexity. It is enormously complex, and if you're a resident living it, it's even not only complex, it's, it can be, really terrible for your existence. I mean, the reason we didn't go into Edgemere as NPCC 4 is because they also have a lot of planning fatigue. They're sick and tired of the meetings and the planning this and the visioning that, and they're still getting effectively pushed out by the market. I mean, managed retreat, poor people have been retreating forcibly by way of their income and their race forever, right? So the idea that we're going to manage the retreat is cold comfort while you watch neighborhoods with really wealthy people living in floodplains, like living it up on the 15th floor. Like, I'm going to survive this. So I can relate to that frustration of looking around and seeing the contradictions of capitalism play out and racism play out all around you, while agencies struggle to, let's do more plans. Let's figure out, these interventions that feel inadequate to the complexity of the problem. And, there is no silver bullet solution, unfortunately. I think the lesson from listening to communities and groups that have been on the ground for a long time persisting is that This is going to require many, many tools, many different types of organizing, a longer time scale, and it's going to take structural work, investments. You know, we do have an opportunity now with billions of dollars of funding that potentially could be coming, but how well is it going to be governed? How is it going to be directed and managed? Are we going to be able to get the money to the places and people that need it, to prepare the places where people can land, to prepare affordable housing conditions? You have to have the land use, the zoning, all the services that people need. Those things don't just happen on their own just because you have money. We have money, but we also need the political will to organize the infrastructure to make it so that the people get that. And honestly, the only way I know that's going to happen, we can have all the amazing indices in the world, but if you don't have organizing and groups that are stitched together, and a lot of the literature on climate gentrification and displacement, what they tell us is the communities that can survive and thrive are those that have the social infrastructure of organizations, housing groups. Do you have housing advocates in your neighborhood? Do you have tenant organizers in your neighborhood? Do you have groups that are working on environmental justice? If you have a healthy social network of those groups that have been for decades advocating for those things, and they're working together in alignment, those communities have a better chance of making it, both through the climate risk and through the housing pressures than other groups, because they will go and demand things from the politicians, from the funding that comes out. So that's one of the lessons of the literature review and in talking to people, that's clear, but there is no, I'll tell you, the NPCC board, I don't think we'll have a.
No.
And
We'll have a suite of things that
Yeah.
we think could lead to just results, but it does depend on all those things Anna talked about. Go ahead.
I just want to make a pitch that all of you PhD candidates, postdoc candidates need to go into government. There's a lot of studies that are out there. They are amazing. They're very important. And there's going to be a lot more, but there's not a lot of people in government that understand this. And there's a ton of job vacancies in government. The mayor's office of climate justice has many job openings, and many agencies do. You should apply.
That these kids working.
Oh, sorry, the state does too. Karina's always hiring. There
And
she
the
is.
national
Department of
level.
Homeland
I know.
Security Emergency Services.
And the EPA
And the
HUD
EPA. See,
and-
like, we
and,
need-
FEMA.
I spent, it's true. I worked in government for 10 years. Did anybody, have you guys worked in government? Yeah. It's an amazing experience. You learn more in government about how to organize outside of government when you're inside than you will ever learn doing anything else. You have to know how decisions are made.
Go ahead.
You learn that people in government are actually good people.
Yes,
It's
they
the
are.
government that is bad.
Yeah. And the siloing, like the governance structures, the budgeting structures that you're forced to do your job in, it doesn't work.
And the laws.
Yeah.
A lot of laws. Go.
Well, I'm so glad the conversation took this turn. My name is Chloe Tucker. I'm a PhD candidate at Tulane University in New Orleans. And I do have questions about the broader.
They should all go into government.
That's fine. I thought it was the only person going on.
I thought like a rain just all of a sudden started like falling on people's.
It's a fun.
Okay.
Well, my question is really about the fact that your data that you presented by nature has to stay within the bounds of the city limit, because that was your scope of study. But the sense of destination community, sending community, people with options to leave and people under threat is, as we saw under COVID, much more expansive and much more even, it echoes New York's broader ecosystemic metabolism of people with money going upriver, going to higher ground there. So if we can consider, and this may be a question as much for you, Karina, in the back, as it is for anyone else up here, but what sense of hope and collaboration you might be able to clue us into in terms of regional planning possibilities around destination communities, sending communities from, say, Jersey City, Hoboken, the
Almost said
broader.
Jersey City and
Don't-
Hoboken.
Exactly, exactly, but where they.
Affordable left in those
Yeah.
places.
Nothing affordable left and a lot of floodable ground there. But if the entire state of New Jersey and its coastline is packing inwards as well, what you've heard about how people with power, with money are currently considering to understand what hazard is and where safety might be. Thank you.
Mark, what did you want to say?
No, I thank you for the question. Not sure I have an easy answer. By the way, say hi to Jess Keenan if you work with him. But I want to go back to one thing that I saw yesterday. You ask people with money, people with power. We're talking about government. I think the private sector has a huge role. The way we shape the relationship with private sector and the way private sector will shape the relationship with us. I saw a couple of presentations yesterday. They were promoting not where to sell, but where to buy. We're gonna give you best course to capitalize on what's coming up soon. So put your money on the side, invest, and you'll make more. There was I feel there was a lot of tension. That was not expressed. And so I think in this regard that we really need to make an effort to be open to the private sector and try to force some of those players to play a game. We need them from an academic perspective. I do think what I said yesterday in my comment to them is, I think we need the data. Beside the data, I think we need to learn what kind of processes you went through to reach the place that you reached, because it's going to save us academics a lot of time to work with you, private sectors and the communities to move forward faster. It's not just about getting the data right. I agree. I mean, there's so many indices and you can make so many choices that can alter some of the things. You can interpret your indices in a socioeconomic and social environment in a qualitative way, in different ways. But I think it's very important that we start to understand and try to play. And I'm sorry you feel like that. I share the feeling with you of being completely disoriented. I don't know, where to go, the directions, but I think the battles that I'm planning to fight, because I don't think I can win the war by myself, but I want to win the battles I fight. That's my positive attitude. It's really to work with the private sector and try to convince them that the financial economic model based on the capitalism, structure that we have now, it's not working for us for these purposes. So you can make the money, you're free to decide an enterprise and go ahead. But I think there should be a work that we need to do, and I'm hoping to move forward in this direction, in which we also start to highlighting some of the MBE, the private sectors, from minority, from people of color, for example, to get more engaged in this kind of things and more, players playing with it. Because I think the culture of private sector is going to create a lot of jobs that if you don't go working in the government, you'll be working in those sectors at the cross-disciplinary path. And it's very important, that the ethics principles driving whatever we, put us here are still going to be there. And if you make money out of it, it's okay. But I think that the idea is be coherent and try to either you're in or you're out in one way. And sometimes you cannot play both. So in this regard, I think the private sector is very important to push the conversation in one direction.
Let me say a couple of things. One on the national, just looking at this like nationally, because I hear that we're focused on New York City. But if you look at the national data, one important point, both in terms of buyouts and managed retreat, but more generally, is that levels of interregional mobility have been going down for decades. Most people who move, including the managed retreat literature, move regionally, right? So I do think it's important to keep that in mind, because that means that we have to be preparing regions. Now, what counts as a region? After Katrina, people went to Houston, right? But then after Houston, people largely, those who moved, stayed in that area. I happen to be working or have been working in Baton Rouge, speaking of Louisiana, for the past few years, which is a receiving city. So I hear you, and it's a receiving city because it's on higher ground. It's also a heavily segregated city by race and class. And we're working in the North Plank area. But in partly what we're doing is trying to, in a sense, prepare a city that's already gentrifying, in part because you never know why people move, right? Of course, part of it is climate change, but there are a mix of factors for why people move. But I think you're right that we don't pay enough attention to receiving communities, whether they're cities or whether they're communities in the region, and how we prepare those. The data suggests that a lot of those, you know, Miami, if you look at the national data, are communities of color, and you look at New Orleans and other, you know, those that are on higher ground are going to be gentrified and displaced. Those that are on lower ground are going to be displaced from direct impacts, et cetera, et cetera. And where are those folks going? So now I think we're getting really good data about mobility, where they are going, but I don't think we have enough focus on projecting where people might go, right? Because of geography and other factors, and preparing those places, and also reducing harm from displacement.
It might be that people go to places where the city is organized and is inviting people to come. And I think there are a bunch of places
Yeah,
that are
there's some,
thinking
yeah.
about that
Mhm,
as
yeah.
receiving cities. And one of them is Buffalo. And it's kind of interesting because Buffalo, we've heard for years, is this place that isn't going to experience sea level rise, and it's going to be very unique for many different reasons, and may not even get, you know, that much wetter, et cetera, et cetera. Well, last December, 39 people died in
Yes.
Buffalo from snow. So you can be thinking all about one climate hazard, and I get chills. Honestly, I just got chills because and then like it just smacks you in the head on the other side. So there may or may not be anywhere that's going to be safe to live, but I think the question is going to be like, how, like, this is like the actual thing of a resilience. Like, we are going to get hit and hit and hit. What are all the things that we need to do to prepare? And then what type of person can withstand different types of shocks and stresses?
Mhm. Are there questions online? Do we know?
But this is also, I'm sorry, I mean, this
People
is,
to tell us.
Okay.
Do we have any questions online? Is anyone checking the feed? In my last session, they were feeding them to us.
oh,
No,
yes, yes.
okay. Okay. Just wanted to check.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have? Oh.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, this is the importance of the compounding effects, right? You know,
Mhm.
yesterday also there was another presentation by the New York City, the New York State, the formerly known the storm, water.
Governor's office,
Governor's
storm
office.
recovery.
Yeah, storm
Now,
recovery. I don't know.
Housing and resilient homes.
They have a fancy name now, but they were showing how people moved within New York City. It would be interesting, for example, and I was discussing with one of them, what is the overlap, for example, if somebody moved from a floodplain to a safer area after and was relocated, what do we know about the hazards in the area? I'm not trying to shoot on the low and take an easy target, but if we don't have compounding effect studies, if we don't have overlapping factors trying to understand, we could do worse than better, because you're moving a lot of people. There were about 600 people who moved in an area where I saw from the index we developed. Some of them were in areas where the CDSB, the index that we calculated, was very high for many hazards. So this is a kind of things that are important in the sense of, if you have cities, so when you move to another area that is not local from your city, you have to keep looking at these things, and so extending this kind of analysis to other areas is extremely important, and looking at the relationship between and the feedback mechanisms. I'm a physical scientist originally, so I always look at the feedbacks between the elements of the system. And I think, how do we look at how the elements of this landscape are interacting with each other, because that's what I like to, continue pursuing in the future and contribute to this aspect. That's incredibly important for me, the compounding effect. There's questions online? Sorry.
I'll also just add to that. There's the New York State just passed this right to know. A lot of advocates were working on this, which will mandate that when you sell a property, you disclose if the property's been flooded before, if it's been because of a climate event, if you have flood insurance, if you're in a flood zone, and a couple of questions. And if you pull the legislation, they actually have all the other questions that you have to ask. And and it seems like a really smart, great idea, but the reality is that it's probably one sheet of a many sheet stack of papers that you get at your closing when you've already decided that you're going to live there, and you cannot in that moment back out because your entire life has been about like buying this apartment or whatever it might be. And we have to be thinking about like, are there ways to mandate it like at the insurance broker level, at, you know, the Zillow level, at, you know, maybe it's the, you know, ABC grading, whatever it might be. We have to make sure that people understand it way before they've already made all the decisions in their life that are going to send them to that location. Yep. All right. Online question.
There's definitely climate fatigue in Rockaway when it comes to flooding issues, but there's still a need for experts to keep working with each other and communities. Is there a working group in Edgemere or Rockaway that has a specific focus on flood resiliency, bringing together all of the different NGOs working on this issue in this community?
Yeah, I think Rise is still, you know, doing workshops. I think I just saw that the Nature Conservancy is given a new grant to do another community visioning process. So I know Rise is part of that group working on that process right now. So yeah, people are still very, and the CLT that was just awarded, that group has been meeting with residents also to plan out both the residential and commercial use spaces and how they'll be programmed and developed. So, you know, there's very active work still going on. Even though there's fatigue, there's still people working on these issues.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Allison Bridges. I teach in the sustainability management program here at Columbia. I also have relocated during the pandemic to Georgia, where I teach, or where I work at Georgia Tech in sustainable business. And I had a question for you. I agree with you with the business community. I've been working closely with a net zero business community, and they absolutely have a big role to play. And I'm curious how advanced the city has become in engaging both on the equity front and with the business community. I did some work with the city trying to think of ways that those, you know, connections could be improved. And I'm curious also about did you mention it was an equity index that you're working on or some kind of equity score? And
Yes, what Marco presented, the climate displacement, social vulnerability score.
okay, I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about who you expect will use that in the city agencies, and if there's any uptake around that. I'd love to hear more about it. Thanks.
Okay, so first, I think on the efforts in general of the city, I mean, one thing we're going to report back this time on what the city's progress has been since the last equity report, giving them those recommendations. And I think it's safe to say that they have done a lot in terms of equity. And so, and not just renaming the office climate justice, but actually, you know, tracking, there have been new laws, new policies. There's been the creation of an environmental justice board. There are industry boards in the city. They're not coming directly to mind. There's a new sustainability council. I think you're on that, with a variety of stakeholders. So I don't think the issue is lack of engagement with different sectors. I think the issue is fragmentation, maybe of efforts, maybe a lack of kind of a particular clear end goal, and then again, how to get there and who's going to pay for it. The indices, so the last time around, we sat with a number of city agencies, the NPCC, and found out that they were all using versions of SOVI, the social vulnerability, but not the same versions, right? So that goes to part of your point, is that, you know, agencies are doing different things. So we recommended kind of one set of indicators, but I think this time around, the point is that those indicators in and of themselves aren't capturing the complexity that all of us have been talking about. And so Marco's work has really been key in creating a new index just for New York City that could be replicated in other cities, though the data is very specific. So I'll let you talk about.
Before you do go to that subject, can I just respond here?
Yeah.
I think that yes, the city does have a lot of these players that sit on their board, but the role that the board plays is very New York City specific. It's not private sector specific. So the city isn't teaching the private sector about what they should be doing and thinking and acting and these things.
True.
Instead, it's the private sector saying to the city, we're concerned about X, Y, and Z, and then the city kind of like negotiating through that concern. So there is a huge gap in what the private sector kind of understands. And, you know, we have, and many people have tried to create a resilience district, or the idea of a resilience district. We floated in Hoboken, we floated in Lower Manhattan. And what we found is that because the landowners after Sandy did their own on-site improvements, and they know what to do that there's a storm, that they don't have an interest in paying another surcharge so that there could be a community-wide solution. So they're like, you know, examples like that where the business sector is doing things just to protect themselves for their like continuity and their own risk, but it has nothing to do with like, you know, actually outwardly using their products and their services to be better neighbors.
So Marco, I think the question is who's going to use the CD? Okay.
Thanks, Sheila. Sheila knows I'm jet lagged, so she has to keep my brain. Thanks, Alison. There are a couple of things I was thinking. The first one is that I wanted to do this work because I wanted to burn some bridges, in the sense that there is really no compounding index for New York City. There's no compounding multiple hazard index in many cities. I did this not because I think, oh, I did it, I'm the first one, we have to use this, but mostly because now that it's done, everybody else would like to do it. So this is a stimulus for the community, for students, for competition. So I wanted to burn these bridges, put it out there to create a sort of a cultural shock before to wait another 5 years before all the other indices, and we have a grant and we put it together. I just wanted to remind also that the NPCC work is totally voluntary. So, so I'm investing 30% of my time on this, and so I'm working basically 140% of my day. But this to say that I had the freedom to also decide how much I want to push. There's nobody, of course, you know, in this regard. The second group that I hope is going to use it is that if we can develop these graphical tools and easy to access boards where, you know, students, community organizers, and local interested in understanding what's going on, they can just really go with a click and understand what's going on in their community. I think data democracy is nowadays one of the largest barriers to what we're talking about here. We think we live in a data-rich world, but we do, but there's a lot of bias. There's a lot of control on that. In the past, it happened a lot. It's still happening, I think, and I started this branch of my work when I put together a data set called SAFER, socioeconomic physical eviction risk data set at the US level, because there was no organized, publicly available data set looking at climate hazard, social vulnerability, and real estate. And I was working with Jessica Keenan on this. And I got really upset. And so I spent 8 months putting together that from existing data sets. So I hope this is going to be part of what can be used. We can go around training people. I'm planning to do that. And the last thing is also, I hope that this is going to create stimulus for young students, young people to say, look, you did, oh, this is wrong. This is what you did. Oh, I think it should be improved, but at least engages a conversation at the cultural level about the importance not only of multiple aspects together, so the social, economic, the physical, the different components, but how to bridge them together. And then I agree with you, Anna, there are so many indices. What do we learn really from this? What is the knowledge that we derive from the information that we generate? And I think in this case is really the possibility of going and understanding, geographically speaking, where are the areas where the multiple hazards combine. And even if it's so early, given the situation where we are now, unfortunately, to take advantage of and to promote some action to help the communities, I think if we do it now, if we start having this conversation, we can burn some steps. And I hope I can, support this effort in this regard. So that's, and of course, happy to extend it to other cities and talk to others how to do it and find ways to apply to other cities.
And we also hope the city uses it. Most
I think that would be
to make decisions,
sorry,
not just on investments, but also specifically when we're doing climate adaptation work, to have a plan for anti-displacement, like not just for climate risk and social vulnerability, but for displacement risk.
And the only way we get them to do it is if we use it.
Yes.
And then we, hold them to the data,
right.
and then they start using it and incorporating.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Karina Cavallo. I work for New York State Homeland Security and Emergency Services. And I'd like to speak with you more afterwards about a specific initiative for New York State and visualizing the different equity priority tools, if you will, that exist out there. Because we recognize this too, and there are implications for prioritization of different funding, right? For what these tools, the outputs are, and they are different. And so this isn't so much a question, but just a kind of ask, if you will, that says, you know, I don't know how much you've discussed or are aware of the FEMA's new community disaster resilience zones, but FEMA is extremely receptive, I think, at this point to ideas. They are very, very clearly struggling, for a lack of a better term, in defining their, you know, in defining it, and want it to come from the ground up, and want it to come from academia and with support from locals. And even in their programs now, like the evolution of what they've used for their mitigation programs has shifted. It shifts quickly based on what is being like kind of more generally accepted. And so as you develop new methodologies, and a good one, like they are actively moving to determine these zones. And those zones are going to get a lot of funding and technical assistance. So really just a plug to say, please help them.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'll be happy to speak with you. But also I work with, because we use the National Risk Index by FEMA, Casey Zuzak.
Yeah.
He is basically on board. Casey is a great person, but he is very low key. I'm very extrovert, so sometimes it takes a while to tune the relationship, but I'd be more than happy to. And they released just the new version of the NRI, but definitely. And I'm a physical scientist transition to this field about 4 or 5 years ago, so I have no idea what the landscape sometimes is. So I'm more than happy to to talk with you, and definitely if FEMA wants to embrace and absorb some academic background
And
to
fund.
and fund, well, it's yeah. I mean, well, that's obvious, of course, but it's.
There are ways to override their
Sure. Yeah. Right. And speaking of fun, I want to give a shout out to our project that because we're talking about funding. We at Columbia here, we have been awarded a very small, it's Catalyst Award. It's basically the vice president, the provost, they decided to stimulate cross-disciplinary conversation to Catalyst dinners. And one of the proposals that came out after that was to gather the people expertise at Columbia on climate justice to understand where can we go as a unity, as a community. And this is basically, it's open to physical science, medicine, social studies. So we are now in the phase of putting together the players who are really happy to commit to build a team that can leverage and tackle proposals to consolidate a sort of, I don't like to call it a center, I like to call it environmental and climate justice laboratory, because people can play, so it's not centric, and we can make discovery. But if you're interested, Sheila is part of the leadership team. The original PIs is basically myself, Paul Galley, still at Columbia, and Jackie Klopp also here. So if somebody's interested, we are having a consolidation now in this period. Feel free to reach out.
And your pocketbook's open.
Sorry?
And your pocketbook's open.
Our pockets are open, but also we're happy to spend it in the best way that the community of the center will decide. Our goal is really following Paul Galley's leadership also in this case. And we all, of course, on board is to really engage all the communities since the beginning. That's why we're having these preparatory team meetings now at leadership level. It's not straightforward, and I'm probably giving it an 80% chance that this will happen, that the original PIs, us, will not be the leaders of the center, but we are trying to understand how to empower those and identify people who are willing, who are belonging to minorities, and then pushing forward the action.
Very exciting, yeah.
I know, Sheila, feel free to add anything else if you want.
No, I'm just coming to Columbia, so but no, absolutely right. I think whatever we do, that it's going to be engaging of external communities and folks who are thinking creatively about how to move forward climate justice, including data, including engagement with communities, including, you know, the stuff that Amy's doing, I think, which is groundbreaking, and just trying to, how do we plan and put communities in front, but also give them the capacity. There's a ton of money coming down, as you know, from the federal government. And I think a lot of us are really concerned and trying to work on making sure it gets to the right places, but also the places that it gets to, folks have the capacity to maximize the benefits of that.
Yes, now mentioned several components, what is necessary, the community,
Yes.
the good ideas, the money. But also there it has to be a political will.
Yes.
And that is very hard, and how to decouple this huge environmental challenge from political cycle. I think there are several good ideas, but there is also implementation challenge and permitting process challenge, and again, political will challenge. So it's very hard to bring all the necessary components on one common denominator in order to make some progress. It's been really 10 years in New York City that we have lived it, felt it. It's getting worse by heat and by stormwater impact. I haven't seen anything really a huge leap forward, a project that's improved. And private money, I'm very disappointed in affordable housing and the numbers that we are seeing. We're actually losing more than we are building.
Yeah.
The developer is a culprit. As an architect, we are at their mercy. So there are so many tiny little problems and loopholes in the whole system. And I don't know how we are going to attack all at the same time so that we can make progress. I'm so hopeful that.
I understand the discomfort.
Okay.
I don't mean to advocate for private sector. I understand your discomfort. What I think is, if we want to change things in the next, or start changing things in the next 10 years, we're not going to change the economic and financial system. And then the private sector is controlling, and we should consider, even when they have these kind of attitudes, what is the good that can be brought here? What can we still, if we close the walls, I think if we put stuff in front of our eyes, that we're going to avoid a big part of a society that can contribute somehow. And that's my position. I'm not saying that we have to do it always, but ethics and moral law are still part of what we are, some of us, and we can still drive that, and some of the people control that, the financial aspect of working in the private sector, and try to make them understand that this is what drives us, and maybe have some players and some strong supporters even in that part.
I mean, I do think that we should recognize there is an opportunity, and I'd love Anna to talk more about this because I think she's closer to it, in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill, and the money that would normally come down through states and localities, and some of it is coming right to communities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true that the political windows
Mhm.
are not great for governance, climate governance, but there are strategies, catalytic strategies, where if right now the amount of funding coming out of the IRA and IIJ, they have to be by law passed through by some of them by as early as 2026, and as getting that money out from the federal government into the hands, not only through state formula funding, but direct assistance. So new community development block grants in environmental justice communities, we're talking in the billions of dollars, money we've never seen before, that go directly to communities through municipalities, through nonprofits, through these intermediary groups that include university community partnerships. So these are like once in a lifetime types of investments that if we're smart and we're strategic and we're organized, we have to be organized, we have to be aligned, we have to be ready to take advantage of this funding so that it will catapult us forward well beyond the next political cycle and grow the capacity of the groups on the ground to try to make inroads now while the money's there. The money's not going to always be there, but while the funding is there, trying to make as much forward progress and take advantage of that while we have it. Because I think it will build the local capacity to withstand the next political cycle and hopefully build your power enough to keep that momentum. So it's one strategy, and groups, local groups are trying to do that. They're trying to find ways to, grab that money through the Justice 40 initiative, through Communities First Fund. EPA just let out their Tic-Tac grant. So, it's happening.
And the tax credit rules just came out. And not only does that incentivize private actors, but nonprofits can take care of some,
And they have direct pay.
can take advantage of these tax. So this is kind of, like Anna said, once in a lifetime, could be catalytic, could be transformed, but only if done right. So I think like more people need to be super focused on taking advantage of this opportunity before 2024, really.
Yes, definitely. And you can go online to funding, equitablejust.org. We have a funding finder, and you can plug in all the funding opportunities that are coming out through RFPs and RFIs.
Just one last thing. Also, NSF and NOAA also they partnered to promote consortium to focus on climate and insurance, so that they're trying to develop a model in which the National Science Foundation is supporting the administrative cost of a consortium for 5 years, for 5 years, and then the research money, they come from a consortium of private institutions that the university can identify who commit to fund this research, and they can take the outcome of this research and integrate into their operational products. This is basically to facilitate the integration between academia and private sectors, but I think we have an opportunity also to shape the private sector through this. This is what I was referring to. And the consortium, it could be of MBEs, it could be anything, it could be big corporations, as long as they have to vote, and basically the university becomes a sort of a CEO of this consortium, and they vote on these things, and they move forward on the research area. So this is another aspect of the private. Amy, I know we have to wrap up soon, but I don't know if anyone you want to have a last word, otherwise.
I mean, the only thing I was going to say, and I think you said it in many more words, I was going to use few words, that political will isn't something that is there, it's something you build.
Exactly.
So we are all responsible for building that political will and giving elected officials that push, but also that cover to make these really tough decisions. And that's the only way that these dollars became available. It's through an enormous amount of political will.
That's right. Thank you so much for the
Thank you.
conversation. Thank you for talking to us.